I'd love to do a little intro of Georgene, who is a professor of psychology here at Peabody College. As a developmental psychologist, she has published articles about very young children's symbolic development and their understandings of pictures, video images, and video chat as sources of information. And I think it's really interesting that you're working with things like Snapchat filters and Pokemon Go. So I'm really excited to kind of hear more about that.
That's almost more a tip of directions this research should go. We're not actually conducting it yet.
Well, then I would love to hear more about the plans. That sounds great. And also just to hear about your unusual path to academia and how that's kind of impacted your journey. And Nick is a fifth-year PhD student in psych and human development who focuses on language development for children and also language production for adults. So he is also a graduate writing consultant at the Vanderbilt Writing Studio. And so thank you both for being here. And Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Georgene, I'm going to start it off with something Hasina just referenced. So you've had a really unique sort of life. And I was wondering if you could give just sort of a brief overview of your history and how you kind of got to where you are today.
Yeah. So just to kind of tell you as a reference point, I didn't start college until I was 36. Okay. So, but yet I was first in my class in high school. So this doesn't make sense. So what happened was I was a normal kid until I was 11, just normal kid on Long Island. And then my mother became one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And if you know who that is, it's this religion where people come and knock on your doors, right? And back in when she became a witness, they were preaching based on their chronology that the end of the world, that Armageddon, was coming in 1975. Okay, like they had said, it was going to come in 1914 and 1918 and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They keep changing it. Anyway, so as a kid, I was growing up with going out door to door on Saturday mornings, always be afraid that the person that would open the door would be a kid from my school who would then, torment me forever. I got to go from being a normal kid to not celebrating holidays or Christmas or birthdays and not standing for the flag for the Pledge of Allegiance. So it was quite a torment and quite difficult. But I believed it because, my mother believed it and my father believed it. And so I believed it. And yet there was always this piece in the back of my mind as I became, a teenager, and they were talking about evolution in school and et cetera. I was always stuffing the doubts back, stuffing it down because it was too costly to change. And it was too costly to face it. And in my family, in order to be okay, you had to just kind of follow the program. So when I got out of high school, I was a missionary and I went to Wyoming and I preached for many years, met my husband, met the religion. He was a convert and he was skeptical. So eventually it didn't hold together and he left the religion. And then I had to decide whether I would just keep stuffing it down or whether I would actually be honest. And he was an honest person, I could tell. So I looked and then I could see it wasn't true. So then at the age of 35, I have to decide, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And, and I knew nobody in Wyoming who was not one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I was completely isolated. It's like being literally, it's like being an alien on a different planet. And so at that point, my husband knew that I had always wanted to go to college. It was a regret I had. And so he said, I'll support you to go to college. And it's not like we were rich at all. He was in construction. But yeah, we worked together for me to go to college. And it was quite a thing because it started out with extension courses in this little town of 5,000 people. And then I went to community college. And then I went to the University of Wyoming. And if you know Wyoming, this is like massive distances, right? So we moved. I moved to Laramie and was kind of a single mom for a while my husband was still in our little town. I was raising our 2 kids in Laramie. But I was really lucky that when I got to Laramie, they were just starting a graduate program. They didn't have any graduate students in developmental psych. And so I got to work with 3 researchers, rather famous, a couple of them, and that helped me get into grad school.
That's awesome. It's definitely a very unique trajectory that you found yourself on. And I can't imagine sort of taking this worldview that I'd had for however many years and sort of having to jettison that and start a new path. So I'm also curious, like, what did you feel were the biggest challenges that you faced as you were pivoting from being a Jehovah's Witness at 35 and then wanting to sort of embrace education again? What challenges did you see going from not having been in school for a long time and then going back to school?
Well, terror for one thing, because I thought I couldn't do it and that my brain was too old. But I'd have to also say, when you're in a religion where there's only one right way and you just have to chew and swallow, right? Then to go into a graduate program where the job is that you are supposed to think critically, that was very different and very difficult. And then after that, I guess I would just say, I always felt like an imposter and I always felt like an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for one thing was one of the places where I was accepted for grad school, and I went for an interview back in the day. You'd go on these actual visits, and everybody in the room, when they had one of those dinners, everybody in the room, their parents were professors. Mm-hmm. And I felt so weird that I stopped thinking about that program. I couldn't go there. It was just too weird for me. And I was very grateful when I actually went to the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and it was, Champaign-Urbana, it's downstate. It is quite a cosmopolitan little place, but it's in the middle of the cornfields. And my advisor was a Westerner. She was from Colorado. And I think she was actually a rancher's daughter. So not that she ever talked much about that, but I kind of felt like they were more down to earth. And so I felt like a fit better there.
Yeah.
So, but it was always like negotiating this thing of feeling like an outsider.
Yeah. And I wonder, so you mentioned something that I think a lot of people experience, especially when they're going to college and they're on to grad school, which is imposter syndrome. Is there a time that you felt like you overcame imposter syndrome, or is that something you still feel yourself sitting with today?
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. I think I still feel like an imposter. Yeah. As a matter of fact, you said I was professor of psychology. I just was promoted just after a bazillion years because I was so afraid to go up.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And it was, I did not know if I would get it. Right. And that's imposter syndrome coming out again, I would say that. But yeah, I think it gradually gets better, right? Because you do have affirmations. You do your research. I did my research and somehow it managed to be relevant and somehow it managed to be considered well done. And it was published. And then I got asked to do chapters in things like advances in child development behavior, or these things. I got asked to do things. Mm-hmm. And if I was a total drudge, if I was terrible, why would I get asked to do these things, right? And so gradually I got affirmation to keep pounding down the fact that I was not good enough because they kept asking me to do things. So yeah, I don't know.
That makes sense. I definitely think that having a bunch of tangible examples of how you're great at what you do helps you get over feeling like you're great at what you do.
Yeah, even if it keeps coming up.
And it's very exciting that you got promoted. Did you do anything fun to celebrate getting promoted to full professor during this pandemic, or did you just have a nice quiet evening by yourself like every other evening?
Oh, yeah. Well, my husband's not much of a celebrator. My son, actually, he's more of a normal person. So my oldest son, I think, cook dinner, and he pushes his dad and his brother to do normal things. So that was cool. And also I'm a skater. I'm an ice skater and ice dancer, and so I make sure that I get out there and skate, and that feels like celebration to get out of this chair, out of this room.
Well, speaking about your kids, one thing you also mentioned is that I think you mentioned you and your husband were maybe living apart for a little bit and you were a single parent. How did you navigate college and grad school as a parent? And did you feel like you were supported by your program, your advisor? And what sort of challenges did you face as a parent in these programs? That's maybe also not as common.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I lucked out because the people that I was working with had kids. And they were people that had good work-life balance themselves. Mm-hmm. So I was always really slow at getting stuff done for kind of obvious reasons, but they tolerated it. Yeah. But for anybody who's listening and is going through this, yeah, it's so hard. It is really hard. So, I mean, when I was in college, I had little babies. And so I was like nursing a baby while trying to write a paper at the same time, that sort of thing, right? Or when my second son was born, I was going to night school, I would actually literally be taking him to class. Yeah, so that it's hard. And then when we moved here, when I got the job, I had to negotiate the fact that my kids were getting kind of dragged away from their family, from their friends, not their family, but from their friends. And so, we were taking trips back to Illinois to try to have the friendships. It just was complicated. Yeah. And so, you just can't expect the same trajectory from yourself, I think. And so for women, particularly if they are doing a lot of the childcare, but also for dads, that are good dads. And so they're not making their wife do all the work and they're responsible people. It's just, how can you have the same trajectory that somebody does who's just only doing a career?
Yeah.
I think you asked other things, but I forgot what they were.
No, that's a great answer. And I can see how that would also tie in to maybe feeling a little bit like an imposter. If you're comparing yourself to people who don't have kids and have a lot more time to get things done, I can imagine that would sort of feed into that doubt that you're having.
That, we all do that, or many of us, I think, do that, where we compare ourselves to other people. But I think it's really vital when you have a weird career or a different career, or you're older, or you have kids, or, you're dealing with life stuff, that you have to set some time aside for that. I guess, one thing that's kind of cool that was ringing in my head is I remember Craig Smith always saying to the undergrads, the first years when they're about to come in, that they should leave some time in their first year schedule for life stuff. Almost like he didn't want them to take too many classes because they're coming in, they're like, oh, I want to sign up for 6 classes and la. And he was always like, no, send 3 credit hours in your head is like doing your laundry and stuff. And I think it's almost like that for us who are doing our careers, that we have to think that we just have to compare ourselves to ourselves and try to feel like we're making some progress and not compare ourselves to the whippersnapper that's, to Nick, who's a whippersnapper who doesn't have, Nick.
I don't have any kids.
Nick has a complicated life, though. So we shouldn't do that comparison. Nick has to compare himself to himself. Yeah.
And then do you think, so you got into developmental psychology, obviously, do you think that having young kids while you were in college and grad school contributed to you being interested in that? Or is that something that you were always kind of interested in?
Well, no, I was interested in everything. When I was in college, I loved English and I loved biology and I did not love chemistry. I loved chemistry in high school, but then it got complicated and I wasn't good at it. And I loved anthropology. And so I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. But, I kept finding out that there were things I wasn't good at. So I wanted to do social psychology, but you have to be really great at stats. And I thought maybe I wanted to be what they used to call a biological psychologist, but then I found out I would have to, be slicing up rat brains and smell like formaldehyde. So I thought, nah. But I was very interested in, and I think this was an emotional connection when I learned about Piaget, and Piaget respected he called them stages that children were in as being interesting and appropriate for that time. He didn't view them as being born in original sin or there's something wrong with them. And I really got that message from my dad that I was always inferior because I wasn't him, right? Because if you're a kid, you're not good enough. You have to become this other person. And I think it was an emotional connection to this idea that development was this process where at each point, the person is looking at the world through their current lens, their current brain development, et cetera, and they're perceiving reality. And then it would change. And boy, coming from this thing where this is reality, no, it's not reality. Now this is reality. I think that really, the nasty term is resonated with. Yeah, that caught me. And so I think that's why. And then the thing about having kids was that it helped me in my research. It just turned out that I'd be sitting in the lab or whatever, and I would get ideas because of having kids.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And I think one thing you touched on is that this idea that the religion you grew up in and maybe the context you grew up in, there was a certain set of like, what is truth and how is truth defined and how do you arrive at truth? And that seems very different than the way you arrive at truth or facts in research. How was that sort of how was that transition for your mind when you navigated that as a college student?
Right. It was a different way of thinking about the world. It was extremely liberating. It was so thrilling. But I do remember like reading a research article and having to really come to the idea that this is just somebody's opinion based on their observations, and these observations could be incomplete, right? And so that there's somebody does another study and the idea changes. It's almost like, boo, it's a revelation. And so it's always been a big deal to me to push to get that idea across to the students that I teach. Because, coming out of high school, they sometimes, at least I assume that they think that, if it's in the book, it's the truth.
Yeah.
And you have to show them that, this is what we know so far. And yet I would feel like I don't view science as a religion, we've seen this through the pandemic, that it's just whatever we know right now. Mm-hmm. And whatever this study shows, but this study might show something different. And so there's some underlying actuality that we'll come to closer to eventually.
Yeah, definitely. And then you also, so obviously you had to make the choice at some point, one, when you were 35 and decided to go to college, but then you also had to make the decision to continue your schooling beyond just the traditional 4 or whatever years of college. When did you know that you wanted to go on to a PhD program? And did you know then that you wanted to be a professor? And how did that kind of shake out in your mind?
I wish I could remember better. I think it was just that this was the most fun thing I'd ever done, in a sense, that I really loved learning. And I was just captured by the ideas of it. Now, that's not true of everybody, right? For some people, it's, I want to do something good for the world. I certainly hear that with the students that want to go into clinical psychology, for example, or maybe they want to go into human and organizational development and have good organizations, or they want to go into to make the education system better, right? For me, it was like the ideas were the thing, and I was all excited about that. So I go into experimental psychology where, it's always kind of tangential whether you can actually make children's lives better. You hope you can, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
And then as far as why I wanted to become a professor, I just liked it. I liked studying. I liked learning. I turned out I was pretty good at research. I liked it. I had some successes, which doesn't always happen, but I was lucky and the ideas worked out. And and so it just was like, hey, this seems, and then of course my major professor was saying, hey, this is the greatest career in the world. Right. And she looked like she was having a pretty great life. And so, yeah.
They always do that. They always try to rope you into their career paths, those strict professors.
I know.
So, and then how did your research, so you mentioned you really, Piaget kind of resonated with you. How did you end up deciding like children's symbolic representation? That's the path.
Oh, yeah. And, this is the thing we always tell people when they go into grad school, right? Or when they're applying for grad school is whoever your professor is, that's what you kind of end up doing, but slightly different from what they do. Yeah. So, I guess I should just tell you this as here's an old person. By the time it took me 8 years to get my bachelor's degree. So I was in my 40s when I finally went to grad school. And yet, because of kind of being in the right place at the right time, working with 3 people and getting their letters of recommendation, I was actually accepted by 5 graduate programs. You could still do that back in that day, right? Because this was in the early 90s. And so I had to decide where was I going to go. Well, I wasn't going to the place with all the blue bloods, right? No. And then it really came down to I was either going to go to Oregon and study theory of mind, which was what I thought I wanted to study because of who I'd worked with. But it rained there all the time. And I came from Arizona. And I grew up in Arizona and Wyoming, and it's really sunny there. Or I was going to go to Illinois and be in the cornfields in the humidity. And I grew up in Phoenix and Wyoming. And so we ended up going to Illinois mostly because of my husband saying, I think I could stand it better there. And also because I fell in love with Judy DeLoach, my advisor. So yeah, it was just kind of like, I thought maybe I wanted to study something like Rene Barjan, infants, or I wanted to go work with Robin Fivish and study gender at Emory or whatever. You go to Minnesota and study memory with Patricia Bauer, but I ended up where I ended up.
Yeah. And I think one thing that you mentioned in that sort of how you picked where you ended up going for grad school, I think is a really important thing to talk about, which is you took your personal life into account. So I think sometimes when people are applying to grad school or even when they're trying to get academic jobs, there's this prevailing myth that you should like set aside your like personal life and you should like be willing to move to rural Montana to take your first job or go to grad school because you should just be happy to have anything. Do you think that in having your more unique life circumstances, it made it easier for you to prioritize sort of the family personal side of things because you had kids and it wasn't just your life you were considering?
I had to, yeah. I remember it being excruciating trying to decide. I don't know if anybody else has been in that situation where, I had my pro and con lists over and over again, trying to figure this thing out because it's like, it's the whole family moving and it's for 6 years. And, Illinois was a 6-year program and it's expensive and, but in retrospect, I can say, I think I would have ended up really depressed in Oregon, even though I would have met Meg, right? Because we would have overlapped. Then we wouldn't have got hired in the same place, Meg Saylor. But yeah, I would have ended up in one of those same labs that she was in. But I think I would have ended up depressed from the rain. So it worked out.
I had the exact opposite. I almost went to Oregon for grad school, and that meant that I wouldn't have met Meg because I was going to work with Meg's advisor at Oregon. So we had similar trajectories in where we were picking.
I would say too, the people that I met when I was visiting all these programs, I ended up being friends and colleagues with them the whole time. I still am, right? So it's interesting how you collect these people as you're kind of going through your process.
Yeah. And I think one other thing that you touched on a little bit was sort of being a woman in research and being a woman in academia. How has that played out over the course of your career? I know that in developmental psych, there's maybe a slightly better balance between men and women in research, but it still isn't particularly great. How have you felt that has manifested over the course of your experiences?
That's interesting. I guess the way I would respond to that question was because I was relatively old every step of the way, I can remember kind of coming to a point of prioritizing. Did I really want to become famous and be one of the cutting edge people? Or did I just want to try to have a good life and be good enough at the job? And I strategically decided to just be good enough. Partially because I had an old brain. I'm being literal here. I always did everything, every step. And, like Dwayne, this is me inside. I'm not a young whippersnapper like Dwayne Watson. I'm not. And I knew it. And so I made a strategic choice that I would try to be good enough and be charming and be a good teacher and use my strengths, but not try to be famous and not try to be the person that's working and killing myself to be a top dog. I just couldn't. And so that was my choice. And so that more than being a woman, I would say that was it, because there certainly are top women in developmental psychology, but it is the people who either because they're geniuses or because like Judy DeLoach, my advisor, was a genius. And so she was able to do it because she certainly had a balanced life. And then there's other people, I think, that just work their heads off. And maybe they're geniuses too. I just didn't feel like that was my thing. But it was more, I think you can probably tell from the way I'm talking, and I'm pretty comfortable at talking to people. I'm a really good teacher. I can say that now. I know I am. And I'm a pretty good speaker. And so I've been able to be, give talks and stuff like that. I have certain strengths, and I've tried to play to my strengths. But then to try to do I'm doing a review right now of a paper, and I'm not a whippersnapper. I'm not quick. It takes me forever to work through the logic and to do a careful thoughtful review. I can't just rip it off like other people do. But, I've managed.
That's great to hear that you really prioritize balancing your personal and your working life. I think that's a great perspective to have. And I wish that I'm always happy when professors share that, because I think it makes students feel like they can take some time for themselves a little bit more.
I need to say, though, times are different now than they were then. So just because I could do it in the decades when I was doing it does not mean that somebody else should feel bad because they're like, well, why can't I do that?
Mm-hmm.
It's the context in which you're trying to do it. I mean, when I had a few job offers, not a ton, but I had a few. And I chose Vanderbilt because I felt like it was going to be a department and a program and an area where I would be supported the same way I had been at Illinois. I had high standards after being in developmental in Illinois. I mean, it was the glory years of Illinois developmental. And so I wanted kind of a family sort of support thing that I had in my graduate program.
You mentioned that things are very different today than they were then. What are some of the most surprising changes that you've seen in academia over time? I know that not having any tenure track jobs in existence is maybe one of them, but what are some of the other things?
Yeah. I was able to, and Meg, this was the same for Meg. I think we were probably the last two people. We were hired without postdocs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when does that ever happen anymore, right? I think we just got in on the very last bit of, that if you had a couple of publications, and they think that the records that people are trying to amass now to get any sort of an interview, it's insane.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's inhumane.
And then this question's a little bit more zoomed out, but like based on your kind of non-traditional, you mentioned you were a first generation college experience, what do you see as kind of insights that you gained into accessibility or lack of accessibility in academia? So I know that a lot of people who come from minoritized backgrounds find that academia can be inaccessible to them. What did you experience from that? And are there any ways that you think we can change moving forward?
Yeah, I remember just not even knowing what a syllabus was, like the terminology. The community college I went to in northern Wyoming, actually up by Yellowstone Park, it was actually one of the more academic programs to accidentally land in, right? But I did try to network with, other groups of adult students. That was helpful. I think this kind of a program is wonderful to find your people who are going through the same thing. And then I was in Psych-Hi in my last 2 years of undergrad at Wyoming. So I guess it was the same sort of thing where I would try to find my people. Access. Can you think of any specifics that I might refer to? Because I'm trying to think of any other issues of access.
I think those are great.
I know one thing. This is crazy. This is insane. I'm actually a McNair scholar. Can you believe that? As a white woman, but it was because I was first generation, and because this was the first year of the McNair program in Wyoming, and they didn't have anybody. I'm sure now they would be more representative of people that don't look like this, but back then I got to be one. Yeah, so I guess I just took advantage. We got Pell Grants. We took advantage of the things we had to because we were poor at that point. Yeah.
And do you feel like, especially as Vanderbilt's recruiting more diverse undergrads, do you feel that there's more students who have experiences that are similar to yours? And are you able to kind of draw on your early experiences to connect more with your students, do you think?
Well, you mean grad or undergrad?
Either one, I guess.
Well, because of feeling like an outsider, no matter whether, for whatever reason, a person feels like an outsider, I do use that strategically. I use that with my first years in my, writing seminar. I use that with, like in advising. Yeah. I love the statement that what Nora Ephron made, the screenwriter for Sleepless in Seattle and other things. She said in their family, they were all writers in their family. The phrase was, it's all copy, meaning no matter what horrible thing happens to you, it becomes something. It's the grist for your mill. You use it later. And so I try to say that with students, that whatever horrible things they're going through, then when they are the authority or whatever, then they'll use that to help the next generation. Yeah, that we survive these things, whatever they are, and then we try not to forget where we came from. and we try to be humble and use that to help other people.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a really wonderful perspective. And this is keeping in line with just being a professor. Generally, what are your two favorite things about your job? So what are the two things that you get most excited about doing?
When students get really, really excited about ideas, that's cool. And I guess I would say when research results turn out, that's lovely. Yeah, that would be my two favorite things, I think.
Do you have a favorite? Which of your research results that turned out is your favorite? Do you have like a favorite experiment and result that you had?
Oh my goodness.
Don't make Israel feel bad if you don't pick one of his studies.
No. This is like from the olden days. We did some crazy things. It's too complicated to explain. I guess I would have to say that I've done a couple of things where I proposed a study. My advisor said that'll never work, and it worked. I like that.
I also think you like predated Skype, right? Like for one of your studies, you like made up Skype like years before Skype existed.
Yeah. Well, it was just, my research, like you said, symbolic development. What in the heck does that mean? It's the idea that when children are born, they're born into cultures that use symbolic things. And I mean, some of those things are truly symbolic, like, math symbols or whatever it would be, or, how you would do computer programming. But then other things are pictorial symbols. So those are some of the earliest ones that Homo sapiens invented. And then there are also some of the first things that children figure out, like, how does a picture relate to reality? Or how does a picture on, like, say, a video screen relate to reality, right? And so some of our early work was with, it was actually live video. So, a kid sees, a 2-year-old sees themselves on a TV. We show them themselves, and we show them a room, and we show them a toy that's going to be hidden on a TV. And there's mom, and there I am, and there you are. And the kids seem to get it. And then we take the TV into a control room, and they watch on the TV as the researcher goes in and hides the toy in the room, and then they can't find the toy. And yet, if they look through a window between the rooms, they're like, yeah, easy, and they can find the toy. So what's the difference? And so we explored that idea. And the reason it became interesting was because at that point, people started to develop video for babies. Mm-hmm. And it was just happenstance that all of a sudden my research is important, because they're developing Baby Einstein and Blue's Clues and all this jazz. Back in the day, it was just, preschoolers you would do Sesame Street for, right? But then all of a sudden, there was this thing about video for babies. Mm-hmm. And so, and so what we found was toddlers are really, really bad at learning from video. But then you can, if you turn it into Skype. And so what we had done was just made a closed circuit system where they're still looking at the same TV, but now there's a camera on top of it that's taking their and their mom's picture into the researcher. And there's a camera on top of the researcher's little TV, and it's taking it in there. So in essence, it was Skype, right? And we didn't know there was going to be Skype, but the idea was, well, what if you actually really showed a child that the person on TV could see them and could talk to their mom, because the kid wouldn't talk to you, could talk to their mom about their birthday and their brother and their dog. And then we did some stuff to say, and actually it's right now. And so we tell them to look under their chair, and there was a sticker in a box. And then every kid would put the sticker on their shirt. Put the sticker on their shirt. And then the person on the TV would be talking to them about this great car sticker or cat sticker or whatever it was. And after just 5 minutes of talking to the person like that, then they would use the information on the TV. And so that tells us a few things. It's not just a perceptual issue, because you can move it around by giving them a different experience. And so it seems to be a conceptual issue. The stuff on TV is not real, which you can see two-year-olds can form concepts. And they're forming the concept that when the cars are, like there's car chases on the screen on the wall in their living room, that's not real. And when there's French fries and they can't get them, that's not real. And they can't get the toys, and and there's dogs talking, that's not real. And so now we ask them to use video, and they're like, no. So then we show them, no, actually it is reality. Then they can learn. And so it shows that it's not a perceptual issue, it's a conceptual issue. And also the children are capable of learning from a very simple symbolic medium, as long as you give them the relevant information that they can form the relation between a two-dimensional thing here that's little and the real world. But it's not easy for them. And then, there's a progression of what you do with education, right? That you have to teach them what do letters mean? How do they relate to sounds? How do sounds relate to words? How do words relate to concepts, et cetera? It's all symbolic. But, this is like the very, very beginning of that.
Yeah. I was thinking a lot about your research during the start of the pandemic when all of the kids were forced to go into like preschool online. And I was like, I wonder like what sort of learning's actually happening for these kids who are staring at the computer screen.
And it really depends on age. But there might be even some carryover for that, where we interpret what's on a screen differently than we do if a person's sitting there. And so there may be a tendency to tune out in a little bit even for older kids, in a way that they wouldn't if they were really sitting there. Well, they'd be tuning out in class too. But
I was going to say, I feel like I tune out during Zoom lectures more than I do in person ones. So I don't know how little kids can tune in at all.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I get asked all kinds of stuff. I've done a bunch of interviews, but it's always like they want the real stuff, not the little stupid stuff, maybe not stupid, the limited stuff I do my research on. But they want to know, how should I keep my teenager to me from doing XYZ on social media? And I'm like, I don't know, because it's such a big field now, and any one person's research is not the whole thing.
And that's something that I think you've done quite a bit, is you've been interviewed on like NPR and you've done some like media outreach for your interview. How do you navigate that, where you're trying to stay true to what you've actually found, but like the media wants to make it accessible to people and they want the findings to be kind of like headline grabby? How do you navigate those demands?
It's hard. Yeah. There's recently I was in Discover magazine, and the headline is something like children's brains and screens. And I'm like, as I'm doing the interviewer, he told me what would you call, what is it called? The clickbait headline was going to be. And I'm like, I don't study the brain. He's like, I know, but that's the headline they want to use. And so, if you actually read the article, he did a brilliant job in the actual writing of the article. But, it's kind of like, what do you do? It's a hard thing. I just try not to go beyond my own expertise. And like my expertise is very young children and learning. It's not how do teenagers deal with social media. That's not what I know about. And so I have to tell them that.
Yeah. I can't imagine trying to like keep like rein in like a media person as you're trying to explain your like very narrow set of findings.
It's very tough. Yeah. But if it's a privilege to try to communicate, important ideas to people.
So I think it's really great to like hear a little bit about your research. And you mentioned that it emerged partially because of the person that you ended up going to grad school with. So I forget if you said, was symbolic development something that you encountered in college that you got really excited about, or was it you sort of applied broadly to developmental psych PhD programs and then you were like, I picked this one?
No, it was more, it was in my wheelhouse, I think, because of the idea that a particular person with a particular background, I'm talking about a very little person, would interpret something differently than somebody else would, right? So a toddler looks at a screen and they go, okay, now we're looking at the screen, now we're playing the game, now we're looking at the screen, there's no connection, right? And I think it's this idea, again, about different people looking at reality and seeing different things. That's kind of like the underlying thing. It's why I was interested in what it's called theory of mind, the idea that gradually children become able to detect mental states, invisible mental states in other people. And so younger children are not seeing in people's behavior the same things that older children are, or that, adults are. I think that's kind of like the underlying thing, is how we represent the reality that's out there. And we're trying to form a mental representation in our minds that's good enough and that's close enough to what's actually out there that we can navigate in the world. That's the bit that underlies all the different things I was interested in.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we have a question in the chat that I will read aloud. So Hasina asks, what do you think might be the effect of the increased screen time for young children during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's going to depend on the age of the child. But I think one major problem is going to be the social and the emotional, that being able to see your friend on a screen, but not actually be able to play with them, and hug them and sit right next to them when you're a little kid or a teenager. I think, you hear about all the depression and the sadness in children right now and the frustration of having to do that, right? So I think that's going to be a major thing. I do think that there could be a learning decrement, possibly because kids are not attending as much, or possibly because there's just that little discount of having to connect between information presented on a two-dimensional screen and even if it's a human talking, like their teacher talking, and then connecting that with the real world. So yeah, I think it's tough. It's better than it would have been, though, right? It's a good thing we had Zoom and other platforms, or we would have been dead meat. I think it helps somewhat, at least.
Yeah. You're obviously an expert on this research area now, but thinking back to when you were just a young graduate student starting out, or a young researcher starting out, what were the biggest challenges you felt as you were trying to grapple with these big issues? Like, what really challenged you research-wise when you were first starting out as a grad student?
That I read really slowly. Again, because I had an old brain, it was hard, right? It was hard for me to be as fast as other people. So I had to use the strengths I did have, which, like I said, I think I just have a pretty good, I'm a good experimentalist. I'm clever as an experimentalist. And because of being a parent and watching my own kids, I think I was more realistic. Like I knew what kids were like. I had to use my strengths.
Yeah, you definitely have some real lived experience with kids interacting with things that
I remember one time, related to my own research. I remember when Michael was a little boy, and back then there were VCR tapes, right? That was all there was. And he was so mad because he was watching a broadcast of Batman, which he was obsessed with Batman. And he was like, I want to play it again. How do I play it again? And it was a broadcast, and so you think about children's concepts of these digital media or whatever kind of media. And it's not obvious how time is represented in television or in media. I remember reading that for very young children, instant replays they're flummoxed by that, because it's like, now we're watching it again. How does this relate to the real world? It's very confusing to young children. So there's all these interesting little aspects of how we use media and the media as a subgroup of representations and symbols. Yeah, it's really hard and very complicated for us to do all the things that we're doing right now so that we can use media. Learning those things as a child and as a young adult, it's hard. For a young adult to understand, how do you judge between two things you see on a screen, and one is true and one is made up, or one is tailored to look like, this person has a wonderful life, but it's actually this curated life. There's so many things that they need to learn in order to deal with, to survive dealing with media.
And it seems like from your research, there may be, and I might be, if I'm mischaracterizing your research, correct me, but there may be like this, there's this period, especially early in development, where like real in-person interaction is the thing that's most important. Do you think there could ever be any form of media that could replace or come close to doing the thing for young child learning that this like in-person people-to-people interaction does? Or do you think that we'll always need that and nothing can replace it?
Well, I would say the short answer is you can't replace it. But the longer answer is that people are really looking now at artificial intelligence and what you would have to do to have artificial intelligence actually be effective for young children. How do you give an AI character like Siri or whoever enough background knowledge about that child such that that thing can actually interact with this child in the way that with the parent's knowledge of the child or the teacher's knowledge of that individual kid could be to have an effective and helpful interaction. I think that's the limiting factor. Although, there's some really clever things that people that I hear about or am, in contact with are trying to do.
Yeah, that's great.
But I don't know, other people may, like we have teachers on here, they may have ideas about this that are, probably more apt than mine.
And I think we have about 10-ish minutes left. So I wanted to turn toward like the kind of like last questions that I had prepared for you. And I was just wondering if you have any advice that you would like to give to first gen students in particular. So people who are, or any student really who doesn't feel that they've been well represented in the academic world generally. What pieces of advice do you wish you'd had when you were starting out?
To trust in the survival skills that you've developed so far, and to use your strengths, even if they're different from somebody else's. One of those strengths being life experience. Another of them being able to connect with other people who also feel this way, and they're where we're in there. I mean, we're part of academia. And maybe to not think that you have to fit into somebody else's box as far as what your career looks like.
Those are great. I think Hasina mentioned at the beginning of this, I work in the writing studio, and I notice a lot of, especially first year students, when they come in, they get they have these like really great ideas, but they don't conform as well to like the standards of the academic world. I think it's really hard to help students, especially from more diverse backgrounds, like find themselves in this academic world that is really tailored itself to be geared toward people who look a lot like me. And I think it's really important to have people like you who have these really unique and varied experiences so that students can see like, yeah, my unique experiences can inform the research that I do, or they can inform the writing that I do.
I think it's hard. It's almost like being a battering ram to change the system, which is exhausting on every level, right? Whether the issue is something like being first gen, or being a person of color, or being a person who is not gender binary, or whatever it is, right? It's hard. It's tough. It takes it out of your hide. I don't know how else the system gets changed. Just helping people to be informed that we're here and everybody's not the same. I guess that's one reason I do this, right? I mean, I could keep all this information quiet. So I hope you guys go off and talk good about me. But yeah, and when Hasina sent it to Allie, and I was like, oh no, all my colleagues are going to come from psychology, and they're all going to know all my secrets. Yeah, but I know Dwayne loves me, and he won't be mean about it.
And this is a kind of similar question to the one about the advice for first gen students. Like, what advice would you give to people from minoritized backgrounds, so that like any minoritized background or marginalized group who may be considering going into academia, either grad school or careers in academia? Is it similar advice that you give the first gen students, or is there special things you tailor for academic careers?
Say that again, that I tailor for academic.
Is there any like specific advice that you tailor for people considering academic careers, or is it kind of similar to the advice you give to first gen students generally?
There aren't that many people don't tend to say that they're first gen. So I don't hear that very much obviously I know from a graduate student, but not from an undergrad. They don't tend to mention that. But I do have a lot of students of color who feel comfortable with me because I try to do this thing, right? I try to do this democratic sort of, not being full of myself, hopefully. And so they'll talk to me, and I'm learning to be respectful, expect a lot of them, make it clear that they deserve to, do anything. And so like just giving advice recently about PhDs in clinical psychology, and then all the other options, but not to assume low at all, because, hey, somehow I made it, so they should too.
I think that's great, especially for students who, like you said, that the program that you interviewed for, where everybody's parents were professors, they have this insider knowledge of how to get into the programs and what is expected of a program. And for a lot of students, they don't really know what a PhD is. They don't know the difference between a grad student and an undergraduate and what's a master's degree, what's a PhD. So not assuming too much about your students, but still expecting that they can achieve the highest level, I think is a really great perspective to take.
Right. So to try to demystify things. Yeah. You try to do that.
Yeah, that's great. And that seems to be something, is that something that you really try to do, especially when you're teaching your undergraduate students?
Yes. Right. Like either in advising or students from my class, I try to make it so that they feel comfortable coming to me for career advice, and then finding somebody who can help them. If it's like they're interested in, they want to be a clinical psychologist. So then I send them off to talk to the graduate students in clinical, and I connect them with people who might have knowledge of, say, a master's in social work as well, so they can see the breadth of the possibilities.
That's awesome. I think that those are all the questions I have. So if anybody in the chat has any that they want to like type real fast, I will happily read them aloud. But thank you so much for answering all those, Georgene. It was great.
Sure. Yeah, if anybody has anything that they're thinking about, please ask. I'm glad to, or, email me. Hi, Emily. I haven't seen you forever and ever and ever. We used to be right down the hall from each other. Yeah,
oh, it's so sad.
I know.
And feel free to ask your questions out loud too. I mean, we're a smaller group, so yeah, we'd love to kind of hear from you and hear your thoughts as well.
There is a lot of reading. What does that mean?
Oh, you had mentioned that was one I actually was a parent in grad school too, and so I actually agree with you. I think like being a parent in grad school forces you to prioritize what you're going to do. And like one of the things that I prioritized was like which readings are really going to help me and which ones is it okay to skim through because I'm not going to finish all of this reading. Yeah. And so, just like finding ways to balance that.
Yeah. What has you guys' experience been in grad school? Any of the things that I mentioned match or intersect with what you've been dealing with or thinking about or careers?
Yeah, I was going to say I got here very late because I was in a different meeting, but I always love hearing your story because it's really refreshing to see someone in academia who's so successful and who has dealt with similar things that because also I'm the first generation, I guess, because my parents didn't go to college. That made me first generation, I guess. So yeah.
Emily and I share imposter syndrome, I think.
Yeah. But I have learned that like my experiences, because I didn't take a typical like straight through to graduate school, have really helped me. I feel more confident in other areas that I don't think I would if I didn't have my experiences before. So it's really nice to hear you talk about it today as like a positive thing, I guess. Yeah.
And I agree. As I've been applying for jobs, I just really liked hearing you talk about like how you really valued like, could I move my family here? Like, what does that mean? Because as I've been applying for jobs, like I don't have a family or anything, but I have been like really trying to prioritize like where will I feel the happiest? Because I think that's a really important part of future planning is like I don't want to take a job somewhere where I'm going to hate going home every day.
For sure. People will try to say, oh, it's only a certain portion of your life or something. And of course, you have to be practical. At a certain point, maybe we'd all like to live in XYZ, but we choose, I never thought I'd live in the South, frankly, or the Mid-South, but here I am. You have to be practical. And yet hasn't this last year told us you never know what next year will bring? You can't put all your eggs in the basket of, oh my goodness, I'll go here and then I'll get a different job and then I'll end up at Harvard or whatever would be the thing that people are worried about getting to. You just have to figure out a way to be happy in whatever choice you can get, right? And I always felt, this is the thing I said to myself a million times. Before I got tenure, if I don't get tenure, I could go back. The first day I realized I was a good teacher at a certain point, which was not immediately, I'm like, okay. So if I don't get tenure, I can go back and teach at the community college. I wouldn't have to go back to Orland, Wyoming and be a cashier at the IGA. Yay, a win. I could go teach at the community college. I think I could do that, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, who cares? It's, I would still get to think about ideas, and I still get to do a lot of the stuff that I love doing. Yeah, so.
Well, thank you, Georgene, and thank you, Nick, for this conversation. It's been great. We really appreciate this. Has been really a great, I think, moment of reflection and just thinking about like how we can think about academia differently. So I really appreciate the conversation. I appreciate everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a wonderful weekend. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.